All right, welcome back, everyone. And so we're entering our next topic here. So just as a reminder, first of all, before we get into our next topic, you have your quiz this week. It is going to cover everything from, again, the period of time of the rise of the Roman Empire through this lecture. So make sure you know all the material before you log on to take that quiz. Again, it's timed, and you're not going to have time to look every single point up, even if you have your notes. So just, make sure you're prepared. There are basically three things we're going to get out of this lecture. Today we're going to lecture on the Islamic faith. We're going to talk about the rise, the spread, and the characteristics of Islamic faith. We had talked about Judaism earlier in the semester. We've started to touch on Christianity a little bit. We'll talk a lot more about Christianity as we move forward. In my Middle East class, obviously, I spend a lot more time on Judaism and Islam, but in this class, we're going to, just kind of give a brief overview. So it's pretty important, obviously, just like with the rise of Judaism, it has a big impact. Rise of Christianity has a big impact on our world today. And there are about, 1.5 billion Muslims in the world today. So understanding this religion is pretty important, even if in a Western Civ class, because as we're going to see, it's going to impact Western civilization as well. So let's go through this. I'm going to start with some key words, and then we'll go through these kind of key points. And again, if you have any questions regarding the quiz before you take it, please let me know. All right, here we go. So here are some keywords. Get them all down. I'm going to go to a map here in a moment to start this. And these words are kind of the keywords about primarily the rise and the beginning spread of the Islamic faith. You will see some very different spellings on this, especially on this lecture, kind of like the Greek stuff. Sometimes you'll see different words spelled differently. I even put like Quran or Quran. You've seen it spelled a couple different ways. If you're watching this, and this is true for all your lectures, and you've got the closed caption on, if there's ever something on the closed caption that doesn't look like what the key word is, go by the key words, because the closed caption sometimes is not perfect. It's pretty good. I go through and I try to correct some of it, but this just rely on the keywords as always. All right, so anyways, pause, get them down, and we're going to move forward. All right, so here's our map. And remember last time we had talked about the Byzantine Empire, so that's kind of on this map as well. What we're focused in on this time is the rise of the Islamic faith. So where do we start? Well, we start from modern day Saudi Arabia. Specifically in modern day Saudi Arabia, the city known as Mecca. And you can see it there. I put it as one of the words. Mecca is where the very important figure of Muhammad was born, right? We don't know exactly when Muhammad was born, right? We don't have the exact dates, but if you remember circa 600 AD for this entire story, you're going to be fine, right? So just kind of keep that period of time around circa 600 and you're good for the start. And so he's born, Muhammad, into this tribe, this Quraysh tribe. And the whole deal with this period of time is that in that time in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, what is modern day Saudi Arabia, there was no monotheistic religion that was dominant, right? There were some Jewish people there. There was a very tiny bit of Christianity. Remember, Christianity is all the way over here in the West, in the Byzantine Empire. This was primarily a polytheistic pagan religion. That was the dominant religion. Politically, they were very fragmented. And so that's kind of the world that Muhammad is born into around the year 600, a little bit before he's born, before 600 AD. So anyways, he's living in this world, and Muhammad at a young age was orphaned. We know that he may have had epilepsy. Why do we believe he may have had epilepsy? Because he oftentimes had seizures, and so some people believe that is an indication that he may have had epilepsy. Again, we're not sure. But at the end of the day, he's living in this area. He's orphaned as a child. He'll get older. He'll get married to a woman named Khadijah. Again, one of those key words there. And Khadijah was very wealthy, apparently, and he gave Muhammad a lot of time to go out in these desert areas and to some of the regions there and meditate, for lack of a better word. And it was at this point that you're going to get the story of how the Islamic faith begins. So Muhammad is the key figure. What happens with Muhammad that brings about the Islamic faith? Well, I think the first thing to know is this is faith. In any religion, doesn't matter if it's Judaism, Christianity, Islam, there's an element of faith to it, right? Did Moses part the Red Sea? You believe it or you don't. Was Mary a virgin? You believe it or you don't, right? And it's the same thing with this next story I'm going to tell you about Muhammad. Muslims believe this, right? Non-Muslims don't. And, it's just kind of the belief system, the faith that's involved in any religion. So as it goes, Muhammad around the year 610 AD is out and about in Mecca, and he's meditating, and he begins to have this revelation. And in this revelation, he begins to get the verses of the religious document that we associate with Islamic faith, the Quran, right? And again, you have a couple different spellings of Quran that I put up there for you. And so he begins to get these verses of the Quran. He doesn't get them all at once. He gets them over a period of these kind of meditative moments of his. And what is the ideas in it? What's the Quran say? Well, it is about a singular God, Allah, the God, Allah. That's where you get the word Allah from, the God. And he takes this idea of a singular monotheistic religion, and he begins to take that religion and go to Mecca and tell the people in Mecca, hey, this is this new religious idea, this is a new philosophy of life, this Islamic faith. Now, Muhammad is not like Christ is in Christianity. In Christianity, Christ is divine. Christ is God. In Islam, Muhammad is not God. He's not divine. Muhammad is a prophet, right? He's not the only prophet, actually. There are other prophets of the Islamic faith. Abraham is a prophet. Jesus is a prophet. I believe Moses is a prophet too. I'm not sure about Moses. I think he is. But you have these interesting Jewish and Christian figures who are prophets of the Islamic faith as well. Why is that important? Well, the reason that's important is because it shows us the connection with these other monotheistic religions. I mean, the whole idea of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is they do share this idea of a singular God, and they all believe in the God, one God. Where, of course, they're different are their interpretations of the religion and the different texts. The Jewish people follow the Old Testament, the Christian people follow the New Testament, and the Islamic people follow the Quran. Which have different ways of interpreting this singular God idea. So that's where, of course, you get very big differences. Regardless, Muhammad takes these ideas in Mecca and starts preaching them. And the people in Mecca don't like it so much. Why don't they like it so much? Well, they kind of see it as a threat to their power. It's something new. It's something different. And Muhammad actually doesn't have a lot of support there in Mecca when he begins to talk about this concept of this singular God, Allah. What happens? Well, nearby Mecca, there's another city you could see here called Medina. And by the way, the word Mecca, before I go any further, maybe you've heard that term used in a non-religious way before. If you could say, something is the Mecca. Hollywood is the Mecca of the movie industry, as they used to say, right? What does that mean? The center, because it's the hub. It's the center, Mecca. So we use the word Mecca today in our English language to describe kind of the centralized, where things begin, in the center, the hub of it. So anyways, there in Mecca, he doesn't have much support initially, but there's a nearby city called Medina where he does. And so in a very specific year, in the year 622, you don't need to memorize this year, September 24th, 622, if you really want to get specific, Muhammad ends up leaving Mecca and going to Medina. This is what we call the Hijrah. The Hijrah is the flight from Mecca to Medina, where Muhammad goes with a handful of his supporters. They leave from Mecca, go to Medina, where he's got more support. Now, the people in Mecca still oppose him. But what we start to see now is this fighting that takes place between the people in Mecca and Muhammad's supporters in Medina. In my Middle East class, I get into some of the battles that are involved. They're not massive battles, but long story short, Muhammad is victorious. And as Muhammad is victorious in these battles, the Islamic faith begins to spread in this region of the Saudi Arabia region, right? What we call Saudi Arabia today. Again, it was polytheistic at the time. They didn't have a monotheistic religion. And so what spreads the religion is a couple things. It is this kind of, military battles that take place, but it is also for some people a chance to go to a monotheistic religion, right? It offers salvation. It has a lot of the ideas of giving to the poor and a lot of ideas that appeal to a lot of people living in this Arabian Peninsula during this time period in the 600s AD. And so that's essentially the beginning. That's the rise. That's how the Islamic faith begins in Mecca, then to Medina, then back to Mecca, and then in Arabia. Now, after that, the Islamic faith continues to spread. And you see on this map kind of where the Islamic faith spreads into. In the years, so it starts over here in Mecca. Then after Muhammad dies, actually, it continues to spread through much of what is the modern Middle East, right? This would be modern day Iraq, modern day Iran, Egypt, of course. And then it spreads throughout North Africa. And what's really important for our class, it spreads into Spain. Now, why does it matter that it starts to spread into Spain? Well, the reason it matters that it spreads into Spain is because, unlike the rest of these regions, Spain is not some polytheistic area. By now, in the 700s, Spain is very much a Christian region, as is all of Western civilization. Remember, Christianity, Constantine, 300s AD. It's been 400 years roughly since Constantine. So this area is pretty well entrenched with the Christian faith. And there's going to be conflicts. And what you end up seeing is the Islamic faith managing to get all the way into Spain. They don't get any further. We'll talk about that in another lecture later. But this is the first time you have this conflict between the Islamic and Christian faiths. A lot of times people think it's with the Crusades. Crusades are hundreds of years away, guys, right? This is when it really begins. It's when the Islamic faith spreads into Africa and then into Spain that it starts. Another really important note, and I get into this more in my Middle East class, but it is also, as the Islamic faith spreads into Spain, that you're going to get something that's going to impact history dramatically. This is actually going to be the beginning of the slave trade out of Africa. I cover this in my Middle East class in more detail. You don't need to worry about it in this class. But the Umayyads, if anybody wants to look them up, the Umayyad family, very important dynasty, is one of the first dynasties that began that through Africa. So just kind of a side note, but pretty important for history because of course, the impact of slavery out of Africa. All right, so anyways, that's the beginning, that's the rise, that's the spread of the Islamic faith. Again, it appeals to a lot of people. It did offer a lot of people salvation. It did offer a lot of people more rights than they had in their polytheistic system before. And so, this religion begins to spread. All right, so hopefully you understood that. Now we're kind of going to get into some of the key core characteristics of the Islamic faith. So let's move on to our next set of key words. All right. So this is probably the most important part of the Islamic faith, just kind of what are called the 5 pillars of Islam. I'm going to go through all 5 of them. You do want to know all 5 of them, so make sure you're clear. I'm going to kind of define each one. We'll just kind of stay on this as we talk about it. So the first one is the creed. And now I should also say, these are things Muslims are supposed to do. If you're a practicing Muslim, you're supposed to do these things. Do all Muslims do these things? Of course not. Do all Jewish people fast on the fasting holidays and eat kosher? Of course not. Do all Christians go to church every Sunday? Of course not, right? But these are things you're supposed to do if you're a practicing Muslim. Number 1 is say the creed. What is the creed? It's just a statement. There's only one God. That God is Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet or messenger. So you're supposed to say the creed. Number 2, they're pretty straightforward, right? Number 2 is the salah. You don't pronounce the T at the end. And the salah is the prayer. So 5 times a day, wherever you are in the world, you face the city of Mecca, obviously Mecca because that's where Muhammad is born, and you do a prayer. So that's the salah. The zakah, the third one, and you don't mix these up. You want to make sure you're clear on them. The zakah is the almsgiving, giving to the poor. And so you're supposed to give a percentage of your income every year to the poor. So that was another one of the 5 pillars. The 4th pillar is the fasting. It's called sawam. You don't need to know that, just as long as you know the fasting. And you're supposed to fast. Now, it's interesting because there's this fasting idea in Judaism as well, where for 24 hours you don't eat or drink, and there's specific days of the year you're supposed to do this if you're a practicing Jewish person. In the Islamic faith, there's also a fasting, but it's for an entire month, the entire month of Ramadan. So the Islamic calendar is a lunar calendar, and the month of Ramadan has usually like 28 days in it. And so what you do is you fast for an entire month. And you should be thinking, well, how is that possible? How can you fast for 24 hours a day for a month? You can't. Well, you don't. You fast during daylight hours only. So when before the sun rises, you can eat. After the sun sets, you can eat. But in between, you're supposed to fast. So you fast during the month of Ramadan. It's kind of an interesting story that, I've been lecturing on this for years, and a question used to come up with, what happens if you're a practicing Muslim, and let's say Ramadan, which falls at different times of the year because it's a lunar calendar, falls in July, and you're a practicing Muslim and you live in Alaska. You got a problem. Why? Because the light is like 24 hours a day. So I've had people in the past ask me that question, believe it or not. And so I kind of looked it up. And basically, what you do in that situation is you go by, special circumstances. I think you go by Mecca time. So anywhere where Ramadan happens to fall during a time of the year where there's like an obscene amount of daylight hours, you can't do that. It's just not reasonable. So you have these special circumstances, as they're called. So that's the fourth pillar. And the fifth pillar is probably the most famous. I'm going to show you a couple images of it. Is the Hajj. What is the Hajj? That's the pilgrimage, right? That is the pilgrimage to Mecca. That once in your life, if you're physically able to, you're supposed to go to Mecca. There's this kind of stone there in a big building called the Kaaba stone. And you go to Mecca. Why Mecca? Obviously, because that's where Muhammad was born and the center of the Islamic faith. And there's a specific time of the year when the Hajj takes place. It's a very big event. Let me show you some images of it. So this is one image of people at the Hajj, right, at Mecca, and you could see there. Now, only Muslims are allowed to go to this. Remember, we talked about the Wailing Wall. I said anybody can go to the Wailing Wall. Well, Saudi Arabia is very strict, and in Saudi Arabia, they're very strict on this. Only Muslims are allowed to go. And you can see they're pretty much all wearing the same thing, white, right? Because in the eyes of God, everyone's supposed to be kind of equal, and you walk and you actually walk around it counter circle wise, and then you pray and so forth. It's a very big event. You can see by the scope of how many people are here. That's one image. Here's another image, very dramatic, right, of all the people there at the Hajj. So this is a pretty big event, and it's held every year in Saudi Arabia. You don't have to go every year according to the five pillars, but you're supposed to go once in your life if you're physically able to. All right, so those are the five pillars. Make sure you know all those. All right, a few other things, kind of last set of key words regarding the Islamic faith. Another kind of thing, I didn't put it up here, but it's interesting, and it's kind of the role of women in the Islamic faith because, I talk about this, and again, my Middle East class, I actually give passages out of the Quran and ask students to read them, and specifically passages about women. And I bring this up because it's oftentimes brought up in class with students, and I thought maybe some of you might be interested to know about it as well a little bit, because there's perception and there's kind of what is really going on. A lot of us have a perception that within the Islamic faith, women are treated with no rights and no privileges, and they can't do anything, and they're not allowed to own land, and they're completely controlled and have to be 100% submissive all the time and all of that. That's our perception very often. What's the reality? Well, the reality is if you read the Quran, you will find passages that talk about the men being more superior to women and having more rights and so forth. Guys, you see that in Christianity and in Judaism as well. You also have passages in the Quran about women's rights, about them able to hold property as well. Now, a lot of it is interpretation. I'll give you a really good example. One of the passages in the Quran talks about how many wives a man is allowed to have. And it says a man may have up to 4 wives, provided that he can care and love for all of them equally. So you'll talk to one Islamic scholar and they'll read that and say, yeah, man can have 4 wives. You'll talk to another Islamic scholar and they will read that and go, no, no, that means a man can only have 1 wife because it's impossible to love and care for them all equally. And so it's a lot of this, and this is true of any religion. Sometimes I say, any religion is what its followers make it out to be. You can interpret a lot of the ideas in any faith in a positive or negative way. Even the word jihad that we oftentimes hear in the West, and we immediately associate the word jihad with violence. The word jihad actually does not mean holy war. It means holy effort. And so you could have a jihad of just bettering yourself. That could be a jihad. Why do we oftentimes hear the word jihad and associate with violence? Well, because there's a group of people within the Islamic faith who have taken that word jihad and associated it with the violence. And this is where any religion has to deal with this, right? How are you going to interpret it, and how do you deal with the different interpretations? And so if you look at Christianity, is Christianity interpreted the same today as it was in the Middle Ages? And obviously the answer is no. And is the Islamic faith interpreted the same everywhere in the world today? And the answer is no, right? It's very differently interpreted in Saudi Arabia than it is in, Southern California if you're a practicing Muslim. And so, all very interesting things to think about. So this is just stuff to think about. All right, so let's get to the words here. Mosque, right? A mosque is just a place of worship where Muslims worship. So Jewish people worship in a synagogue, Christians in a church, and Muslims in a mosque. I'll show you an image of a mosque in a second, and a minaret. Get down these other terms. I'll talk about what they are in a second. They're going to be important as well here as we talk about the last bit of the Islamic faith. So Shiite, Sunni. Actually, I'll do them here, and then I'll just show you a picture of the mosque and minaret so you have them up. I'll just do it that way. So I'll show you a picture of the mosque in a second. So here you have these two terms, Shiite and Sunni. What is that about? Well, this is another really important part of the Islamic faith because I just got through talking about interpretations. Well, if you think of Christianity, you have Christianity, but you have Catholics, you have Protestants, you have very different denominations. In Judaism, you have Orthodox, Conservative, Reform Jews. Well, in the Islamic faith, you have a split, a schism, as it's sometimes called, within the Islamic faith that's really important. And out of this, you get these two groups, Shiite and Sunnis, right? Sunnite, Shiite, you'll have different ways of saying and spelling these terms. What is going on here? You really need to know this. So when Muhammad dies, the question arises, who should lead the Islamic community? Who should be the leader? And two trains of thoughts developed, right? One thought was that the leaders of the Islamic community, I'm going to start with the Shiites, believed that the leaders of the Islamic community should come from the blood relatives of Muhammad. Muhammad had a daughter. Muhammad was married. His daughter was married to a man named Ali. And therefore, the Shiites said Ali, who was also blood related to Muhammad, he should lead the Islamic community, and then their blood descendants should continue to lead the Islamic community. So that's the Shiite belief system, right? So that was part. Then you had the Sunnis, and the Sunnis said, no, 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 no. The leaders of the Islamic community should come from the inner circle of Muhammad, his closest companions, his right-hand men, however you'd want to phrase it. And there was a man named Abu Bakr, and the Sunnis said, no, Abu Bakr should lead the Islamic community, and he would be a Sunnite. And so what happens is there's a split. And some of the people following the Islamic faith support the Sunni philosophy, Abu Bakr. Others support the Shiite philosophy, Ali. And the unfortunate reality is ever since that split takes place, and this happens right when Muhammad dies, around the 630s AD, these two groups, the Sunnis and the Shiites, have been fighting. And unfortunately, it has been very bloody and brutal. We talk a lot about the conflicts between religions, Christianity and Islam and so forth. There's a sad reality that there very often is a lot of bloodshed within religions, right? Christians fighting Christians, if you think about the Protestant Reformations. Muslims fighting Muslims, if you think of the Sunni and Shiite conflict. 1980s, there was a big war between Iran and Iraq, two Muslim nations. Iraq was more Sunni, Iran very dominant Shiite. Iraq is actually kind of split. They have some Sunnis, some Shiites, very mixed. And so there was a big war, and it was heavily fought because of this issue. And it was like 1 million people killed, right? And so very often this leads to conflicts within the religion. Now, the difference is in Christianity, you don't see that anymore today in any sort of significant way. You don't turn on the news and hear, a Protestant killed a Catholic because they were Protestant or Catholic, right? That happened in the past a lot. It happened in Ireland in the 1990s a little bit. But in terms of massive conflicts, not so much. Unfortunately, in the Islamic faith, it's still a big problem in some areas of the Middle East. It comes and goes depending on the time and place. So anyways, that's the split. So you definitely want to know that. The majority of Muslims in the world are Sunni. I think it's like 75% are Sunni. There's about 25% are Shiite. And then there's some other groups as well. But if you know Shiite and Sunnis, those are good. All right. So anyways, that's kind of the last big thing I really wanted you to know about the Islamic faith. Let me show you an image So this is a mosque, and you go, wait a second, this is a mosque? It looks familiar. If you look at our last lecture, remember we had talked about the Byzantine Empire, and I showed you this image as well, and I said it was Hagia Sophia, a church. Well, it was a church, but if you remember also when we talked about the last lecture, when I talked about the Ottomans and how the Ottomans entered Constantinople and defeated it and changed it to Istanbul, well, they also took this church and made it into a mosque. How do you recognize it's a mosque? These pillars, right? Those are the minarets. So a lot of mosques have pillars or minarets. What are they for? They're not there just to look pretty. They're there because they help the prayer, right? When you do the prayer the 5 times a day, in the olden days, somebody would sit up there and they would lead the prayer. Today, they put loudspeakers and it booms everywhere and you can hear it. So that's a minaret. So this is an interesting story because actually around the year, what is it, 2020-ish, a news article that, it was a church, right? Then it was a mosque, and then eventually it just became a museum. And if you went to Istanbul, which is still in Turkey today, it was a museum for a long time. And I was just reading recently that now there's some plans to take it back and make it a mosque again. So it is one of these areas that does change. Again, it's not unique to the Islamic faith. If in Spain, there's a place called Cordoba. It was a church, and then it became a mosque, and then became a church again, and now it's a museum or a tourist attraction. So again, you see this very often when one religion comes in and tries to displace another, and so they change often. All right, so anyways, that's a little bit about the Islamic faith. All right, so I hope you got some good information, some interesting ideas to think about. And again, if you have any questions, let me know. Other than that, we'll just move forward with more lectures. We're going to kind of swing back westward now and start talking about the Middle Ages in the West as we kind of get through after the Germania and all of that. We're going to get into some fun stuff. All right, you guys have a good one. Thank you.